You know how the saying goes. You wait your whole life for a billionaire-backed right-wing TV channel committed to defending oligarchic interests and attacking minorities to emerge, and then two come along at once. Yes, less than 12 months after the launch of GB News, the Murdoch-owned TalkTV has launched in the UK. And it's essentially a vehicle for Piers Morgan. His new show is called Piers Morgan Uncensored, and he launched it by comparing himself to Nelson Mandela. He then went on to say this.
I want to issue an urgent trigger warning. For all ultra-sensitive, permanently offended woke snowflakes who may have accidentally tuned in tonight, you're not going to enjoy this show. In fact, it's going to really annoy you. It may even provoke trauma, because I'm going to be constantly celebrating the one thing you can't abide, free speech. And that's real free speech, not your kind of free speech, where only your opinions are allowed, and anyone with a different opinion has to be shamed, abused, and cancelled, their careers and reputations destroyed.
As you can see from that clip, the whole thing's quite embarrassing, but the production values are higher than GB News. In many ways, it is worth saying the channel is less ambitious. There will only be 3 hours of proper TV on the channel per day. The rest of the time, it will stream the right-wing Murdoch-owned talk radio. Now, tuning into that for a few hours at a time, I cannot imagine why anyone in their right mind would do that. Piers Morgan Uncensored, for what it's worth, averaged 317,000 viewers during its first episode, beating both Sky and BBC News. That dipped slightly by Tuesday, so then 216,000 people tuned into his show. And as you can see, hardly anyone watched the other two shows on the channel. The 7 p.m. slot is hosted by Tom Newton-Dunn, that of the repeating neo-Nazi conspiracy theories, and the 9 p.m. slot by Sharon Osbourne. As you can see from Jim Waterson's tweet, it was only Morgan's show that beat the failing GB News. So what are people tuning in to Piers Morgan Uncensored for? Well, from the clip we showed you, it's nearly all rants about trigger warnings and cancel culture. But Morgan has also done some hard-hitting interviews. This is him talking to Donald Trump.
So I watched the Oprah Winfrey interview with Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. And I'm angry watching it.
And you were right to be.
I thought the attacks on the royal family were disgraceful.
I agree.
And unsubstantiated. And calling them a bunch of...
By the way, I agree with you.
Right.
I'm a big fan of the Queen.
So let me ask you what you would have done then. So then it turns out Meghan Markle writes to my boss at ITV and basically demands my head on a plate. Yeah. And the next day I'm told I've either got to apologise for disbelieving her, or I had to lose my job. Now, what would you have done?
I would have left, but I wouldn't have attacked the weatherman. You know, he wasn't worth it.
Well, I didn't attack him. I left the room.
Well, you did. No, you attacked him. He attacked you, and then I would have handled it differently, but that's okay. You know.
But would you have apologised? Would you apologise? I've known you a long time.
Yes, that was Piers Morgan asking the former president of the United States about the time Piers Morgan walked out of Good Morning Britain. These are the questions everyone else is too scared to ask. Thank God, finally, we have a show that's uncensored. I have one last clip of Talk TV for you. This is the opening credits of Morgan's show. Those were the genuine visuals, a giant spinning brain with the words woke insanity, cancel culture, snowflake society, identity politics, and censorship floating around the spinning brain. Any comedy nerd might have noticed we didn't actually play the original music. What you heard was from the 90s satirical show The Day Today. Someone put together that mashup because Morgan's intro looks almost exactly like Chris Morris's parody version. Dahlia, I don't know if you tuned in for the whole opening night, but from what you've seen, what's your verdict on Britain's newest channel?
This is a classic case of projection. The very things that Piers Morgan is naming as the targets of his show, cancel culture, the stifling of political imagination, censorship, the narrowing of the frame within which we can have political discussion. That is a culture that actually not only is Piers Morgan partly responsible for, when we talk about the culture of that is actually real rather than the one that's imagined in the deep recesses of Piers Morgan's fears and fantasies. The actual reason that we have stifled political debate, stifled political imagination, an actual cancel culture where people aren't just being sent a few mean tweets or aren't just being kind of called out, but are actually, in the case of Julian Assange, having their freedom taken away from them. In the case of activists and everyday people who unfortunately often find themselves in the crosshairs of the Murdoch press, that culture, as it exists, is actually much more the responsibility of people like Piers Morgan and Rupert Murdoch than it is of the people that he is associating it with, i.e. Black people, brown people, trans people, queer people, etc. Piers Morgan's entire career is essentially indebted to one super rich guy, Rupert Murdoch, a man who perhaps more than anyone else in this country has been responsible for the concentration of power in the media, for the shrinking of the imagination of the British people as to what can be possible, for destroying the lives of anyone that happens to fall in their crosshairs, whether it's entire communities of people, like, as I said, like migrants or refugees, or whether it's individual activists who have had their lives ruined by the Murdoch press, who stand for a political vision that Murdoch himself doesn't agree with. That culture where 3 media companies own 90% of the media in this country is the most powerfully corrosive threat to free speech in our society. The idea that it's from a Murdoch platform and from the mouth of Piers Morgan, who has made it his business to go after and cancel people with whom he does not agree. Let's not forget about how he treated Insulate Britain protesters, where he treated them with more contempt and anger and bad faith arguments than he treated powerful people like Donald Trump. The deep irony of that cannot be lost on me. People understand and people feel that their political imagination is being restricted. They feel like the realm of what is possible is being deliberately shrunk. And the ability of someone like Piers Morgan and Rupert Murdoch to switch that and cultivate this understanding, this fantasy that it is because of the existence of trans people, the existence of Black people, the existence of migrants, that is why people feel that restriction on themselves, is honestly a work of genius, but it is incredibly dangerous. And what's more, for Piers Morgan, of all people, to be talking about snowflakes, this is the man who kicks off every time Meghan Markle leaves her home. Like, it is the most stunning act of inversion and projection that I have seen in such a long time. We need to actually think about how we're going to strategize around this. For a long time, we have felt, okay, we've lost the mainstream media, but we have digital platforms. We have Twitter, we have YouTube, etc. Obviously, we are seeing that platforms like YouTube and Twitter don't actually problematize the power model and the ownership model that exists in a lot of legacy media. But on top of that, we are also seeing huge amounts of resources being funneled into more social media savvy outlets such as this one. We've had a lot of discussions about how should we engage with this particular phenomenon, with the contestations around power and ownership in digital platforms, but also in the increasing money that is being thrown into more social media savvy formats that are perhaps also sort of combining the legacy media, social media phenomenon. I don't know what the answer to that is, but it is clear that this has to be a very key part of our strategy going forward, because that inversion of reality, that inversion of the truth is a direct threat to our ability to organize. But also, that doesn't mean that we retreat. It doesn't mean that we start acting like we are snowflakes, or having this be our audience and having this be the terms on which we define ourselves, but actually call it out for the inversion and the hypocrisy that it is. So use the weapons that they are sharpening back against them.
I mean, I agree with you. Like, they are much worse at cancel culture than the left. Like, I mean, especially, I think the strongest example of this is how Jeremy Corbyn was tweeted. Like, he had some positions on Zionism and some positions on NATO, which sort of like, they weren't debated honestly, they were made taboo. And the fact that he held them made him beyond the pale, which is sort of like kind of the definition of cancel culture. We might disagree. I mean, I do think cancel culture on the left exists. My position on it is kind of anyone who spends more than 5% of their time talking about it is probably a reactionary, because it's just it's not that important. Like, I think it's real. But if that's your obsession, then something's gone a little bit wrong, I think. Or you're not an honest player, which is, the case with Piers Morgan. I want to go to some commentary on TalkTV. Jim Waterson did a decent explainer in The Guardian over the weekend, which included this detail from former Sun editor Kelvin MacKenzie. Waterson writes, MacKenzie, who picked up his phone while pouring concrete down rabbit holes in his garden, predicted that Morgan's show will work 101%, as long as he stuck to bashing woke policies and stayed away from political news. He said political discussion was a turn-off for most viewers, suggesting the 7 p.m. show hosted by Newton Dunn faced difficulties. Quote, I don't think he's got a prayer. GB News have shown how difficult it is to attract an audience with politics. It's just an impossible thing. I thought that was an interesting comment from Kelvin MacKenzie, a very, very objectionable person, but, he was a editor of a mainstream newspaper that was quite successful, I have to say. And my response, I suppose, was, is it really impossible? Is it really impossible to have a successful show which is based on politics? And sort of my response is, on a fraction of TalkTV's budget, we've built up a pretty decent audience by talking about politics. It's not as big as would justify the money they've poured into it, but if we can get millions of views per month, it was 3 million last month, surely TalkTV can get 10 times that with, I presume, at least 100 times the budget. Why can't they rise to that challenge? And then thinking about it some more, I think I do have the answer, which is it won't work for them. People watch our show because we tell the truth about the government. When their policies on the cost of living suck, we say that. When they dole out money to their mates, we talk about that. And when they make policy which benefits no one but billionaires, that leads our shows. But TalkTV or GB News, they can't do any of that because they're owned by precisely those billionaires that benefit from our corrupt government. So all they're left to do is whine about cancel culture and what university students may or may not have said online, because that's the only thing they can make them seem oppositional against. If you can't oppose the government, if you can't oppose the ruling class structurally, what are you left to do? Make it seem as if some tweets from university students are the real issue facing ordinary people today, on which, the future of the world rests. I don't think he genuinely thinks it, but he's positioning himself as this warrior for truth, this warrior for ordinary people, by arguing with a princess in LA and some tweets, because he can't challenge the real issues which are affecting people's lives. He can't have a decent critique of Rishi Sunak's spring statement or the fact that Boris Johnson has no answers to the cost of living crisis, because that would require him to have a critique and analysis of wealth and power in this country, which when you're employed by Rupert Murdoch, you cannot afford to have.
We clearly have a somewhat generational, but not entirely generational shift that is happening. And that is the audience for this TV show, particularly sort of white property owning boomer men, but also not just that generation, also, younger versions of that as well, are experiencing a very minor loss, not of economic power, but of social and cultural power. There is an increasing space for voices and needs and thoughts of people who don't fit into that category to actually be heard and to be taken seriously. That's the key. It's not just about being heard. It's about being heard, actually being translating into action or being translated into being taken seriously. And again, I have to insist, it is incredibly minor. The culture is still, and politics is still dominated by white, wealthy men. But this entire dynamic that we're seeing play out there, this panic, this frothing at the mouth that we are seeing, this kind of caricature that we are seeing represented by Piers Morgan, and the fact that, it probably will work for at least for a certain period of time as a model, is because there is a backlash happening to that minor loss of power. And so we should see this backlash, yes, as something to be anxious about, as something to be nervous about and to strategize around. But we should also see it as a mark of our own power. If they weren't threatened by the coalition that is being built by working class people, at least in the cultural domain of people who are working class people who are less easily divided by gender, race, sexuality, etc., people who understand the struggles and ally themselves with the struggles of people that don't necessarily have the same experiences of them. If they weren't threatened by that, then they wouldn't bother. And this makes me think a lot about our last Black Lives Matter uprisings that happened in this country, particularly surrounding the fall of the Colston statue. We saw in that moment white kids of all different geographic backgrounds, kids of all sorts of class backgrounds from all parts of the country, not just the big cities, but actually like villages and towns coming out in support of the fall of the Colston statue and for Black Lives Matter. That is a marked shift from where we were, 5 years ago when the Roads Must Fall campaign first came onto the scene. I think that shift, particularly amongst white people, and the fact that white people are gaining somewhat of an anti-racist consciousness, I think that a lot of the resources being thrown at these particular projects is an attempt to curb that. Is an attempt not just to curb the activities and the behaviors of people of color, of people who are marginalized, but actually it's in order to curb the bonds of solidarity that are being formed around these struggles by trying to stigmatize that solidarity so much that unless your life literally depends on it in the way that it does for marginalized people, you won't bother getting involved, you won't bother advocating, or you'll feel less inclined to act in solidarity with people who might not have the same experiences of you, who might have less power than you. So I actually think that a lot of this is not just about curbing particular developments in the anti-racist movement, developments in the migrant justice movement, in the climate justice movement, but specifically breaking the bonds of solidarity that are clearly forming between different communities. And we saw that not only in the Black Lives Matter protests, but we also saw it, frankly, in the COP26 protests. One thing that we often don't talk about with the COP26 protests is the fact that, yes, it was this huge demonstration of people power demanding climate justice, but actually that it was also a really marked shift in the expression of climate justice through a lens of racial justice, of global justice, of queer justice, of migrant justice, of feminist justice. It was a beautiful connecting of all of these struggles that had previously been separated, that now by lumping all of those people together as snowflakes, as whatever, it's an attempt to try and stigmatize the participation in that growing movement. So whilst we should be concerned and whilst it is certainly worrying, I don't think we should just laugh it off as something funny. I think it is a genuinely worrying move. Just because GB News has been a failure doesn't mean that they're not going to get up and keep trying and trying again to find a model that works to push this politics even further. We should also see it as a sign that we're doing something right.